Audiobook, The Story of Gladiator, an alternative version. Hello YouTube friends. Here with a new video. Gladiator Story, the movie of the year 2000. Maximo Decimus Meridius, general of the northern armies, is a man loyal to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who considers him as a son. Maximo has led Rome to victory against the barbarians, and his only desire is to return to his home, where his wife and son await him. But destiny has other plans. Marcus Aurelius, aged and tired, wants to restore power to the Senate and elect Maximo as his successor, overriding his son, Commodus. When Commodus discovers his father's intention, he murders him in a fit of rage, taking the throne for himself. Maximo refuses to swear allegiance to Commodus, making him a traitor. He orders his execution, but Maximo escapes, only to discover that his family has been brutally murdered on Commodus' orders. Heartbroken, Maximo is captured and sold into slavery. Stripped of his title and rank, he is forced to fight as a gladiator in the arenas of the Roman provinces, where his combat prowess makes him a legend. Under the tutelage of Proximo, a former gladiator, Maximo once again finds purpose, revenge. As he rises through the arena, Maximo is eventually brought to Rome, where he confronts the man who took everything from him. Despite being at a disadvantage, he becomes the people's hero and challenges Commodus' tyranny. Fate leads them to a final confrontation in the Colosseum, where Maximo, although wounded, he defeats Commodus, but succumbs to his wounds soon after. Before dying, Maximo frees his fellow gladiators and restores power to the Senate, thus fulfilling Marcus Aurelius' wish. In his last breath, Maximo is reunited in his mind with his family on the Champs-Élysées, leaving behind a legacy of honor and bravery. This summary covers the main events of the film. Now an alternative version of the main story. Chapter 1, The Glory of Rome. The cold morning breeze stirred the treetops in the vast forests of Germania. A thin mist covered the ground, like a veil separating the present from the inevitable bloodshed that was to come. The birds were silent, aware of the omen of death that loomed over the valley. In the middle of this gloomy landscape, stood the army of Rome, firm and disciplined, prepared to face the barbarian hordes that defended their lands with fierce determination. At the head of this formidable army was Maximo Decimus Meridius, a man whose presence commanded respect and loyalty among his men. His armor reflected the faint light of dawn, and his eyes, full of determination, swept the battlefield. Maximo was a man of honor, forged in the harshness of war, but not without the softness of a heart that he longed to return to his home, to his wife and to his son, to the peace that only life on his farm could offer him. While preparing his men for battle, Maximo walked the lines, offering words of encouragement and making sure everyone was ready for what was to come. He knew well the brutality of the Germanic barbarians, but he also knew that Rome could not be defeated if they stood united and fought as one. He paused for a moment, leaning toward a young soldier who was trembling slightly. "Rome is watching us today," he told him, his voice firm but comforting. "We fight not only for glory, but for the peace we will bring to our homes. Stand firm, and victory will be ours." The young man nodded, taking strength from his general's words. Maximo patted him on the shoulder before continuing on his way, knowing that these words could be the last many of these men would hear. But death was not something he feared. He had seen it up close many times, and he knew that, in the end, the only thing that mattered was fighting with honor. Shortly afterward, Maximo joined Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who watched the horizon with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The emperor, now elderly, saw in Maximo the son he wished he had had, a man of principles, capable of leading with justice. As the trumpets blared, announcing the start of the battle, Marcus Aurelius confided to Maximo his concerns about the future of Rome, about his son Commodus, and about the fate the empire might face under a corrupt leader. "Rome is the great beacon of civilization, Maximo," the emperor said, his voice filled with years of wisdom. "But he fears that if it falls into the wrong hands, everything we've built will crumble." Maximo, respectfully, nodded, but in his heart he knew that his duty was on the battlefield, not in the power games of the capital. However, the conversation left him with a feeling of unease, a shadow that would soon become materialized in betrayal. With a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself, the barbarians charged. The battle began as a chaos of screams, steel and blood. Maximo, mounted on his horse, led the cavalry charge, cutting through the enemy ranks with a precision and ferocity that seemed inhuman. All around him, his men fought with the same intensity, inspired by his leadership. Every blow of the sword, every cry of agony, was a reminder that Rome's glory was paid for with the blood of his enemies, and sometimes, with that of his own men. The battle lasted for hours, but ultimately, Rome's forces prevailed. The barbarians were defeated, and the battlefield was littered with bodies, both friendly and enemy. When it was all over, Maximo walked away from the field, exhausted but victorious. He approached Marcus Aurelius, who was observing the remains of the battle with sad eyes. The emperor knew that his time was coming to an end, and that the fate of Rome would soon fall into someone else's hands. At that moment, he decided that it would not be his son who would inherit the empire, but the man who had proven himself to be the true protector of Rome. "Maximo," said the emperor, with his weak but determined voice, "when my time comes, I want you to be the one to carry the banner of Rome. Return it to the Senate and return power to the people. Rome cannot fall into the hands of my son Commodus." Maximo was stunned by this request. He was a soldier, not a politician, and the responsibility the emperor was giving him was enormous. But he knew he couldn't refuse, not when his duty had always been to protect Rome. He nodded solemnly, not knowing that this promise would be the catalyst for events that would change his life forever. Chapter 2: The Betrayal. Dusk fell over the Roman camp, casting long shadows over the tents and banners that fluttered in the wind. The air was filled with a tense silence, interrupted only by the occasional murmur of the soldiers who, after the battle, were preparing to rest. But in the heart of the camp, in the emperor's tent, an event was brewing that would change the destiny of Rome. Maximo appeared before Marcus Aurelius in the silence of the night. The emperor sat on a simple stool, staring into the distance, beyond the flickering flames of the campfire. His face was marked by the fatigue of the years and the worries of an empire that he felt slipping through his fingers. Seeing him, Maximo felt deep compassion for the man who had ruled with wisdom and justice, but also a growing uneasiness about the burden he knew was going to be imposed on him. "Maximo," the emperor began, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I know you are tired. But there is something we must discuss, something that cannot wait." Maximo, always respectful, nodded and approached. Marcus Aurelius stared at him, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of his face. Finally, he spoke, revealing his plans for the future of Rome. "When I die, Rome must become a republic again," said Marcus Aurelius, with a seriousness that brooked no argument. "I have ruled with all my being, but absolute power is a poison, Maximo, and Rome must not fall into the hands of one who cannot resist it. I want you to be the one who returns power to the Senate, who guides Rome towards a better future." Maximo felt a lump in his throat. He had never wanted power, he only wanted to return to his home and his family. But he understood the magnitude of the task that his emperor was giving him, and he knew that he could not refuse. His duty had always been to Rome, and if Marcus Aurelius believed he was the one for this mission, he would accept it, no matter how difficult it might be. "I will," he finally answered, his voice firm. "I will do it for Rome." The emperor smiled weakly, relieved to have secured the future of the empire he loved so much. But his relief was short-lived, for not long after, his son Commodus burst into the tent. With a look that mixed rage and despair. Commodus had heard fragments of the conversation between Maximo and his father. Enough to understand that he had been disinherited, that his own father did not trust him to govern Rome. His heart, always eager for his father's approval, broke into 1,000 pieces, and from that pain was born an anger that he could not control. "How can you do this to me?" Commodus demanded, his voice shaking. "I am your son, your blood. Rome belongs to me by right." Marcus Aurelius looked at him sadly, aware of the damage he had done by failing to mold Commodus into the leader he desired. He knew his words would be like daggers to his son, but he also knew they were necessary. "Commodus, you have fought to win my love, when all you wanted was my throne," said Marcus Aurelius, with a bitterness that only a father can feel. "I can't trust you to guide Rome. Power would corrupt your soul, and our great empire would crumble under your hand." The emperor's words were the last straw. In a fit of fury, Commodus hugged his father, but not with affection, but with force. In a moment of madness, as tears streamed down his face, he suffocated Marcus Aurelius. Whispering promises that he would make Rome great, that his name would be remembered. Maximo, oblivious to what was happening, was summoned to the tent only to find Commodus next to the inert body of Marcus Aurelius. The young emperor's eyes were filled with a dark fire, and when he spoke, his voice was firm, but with a touch of desperation. "The emperor is dead, Maximo," said Commodus, staring at him. "The Senate has proclaimed me his successor. Now, as a loyal servant of Rome, I command you to swear allegiance to me." Maximo's heart was pounding. He knew that something terrible had happened, that Marcus Aurelius' death had not been natural. But at that moment, he was faced with a choice that would define his destiny. He could bow to the new emperor and keep his life, or stay true to his promise to protect Rome and face the consequences. Maximo looked Commodus in the eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal in his soul. Silently, he shook his head. "My loyalty is to Rome," he answered, his voice firm. "And Rome does not belong to you." The betrayal that had begun with the death of Marcus Aurelius was completed with the death sentence of Maximo. Commodus, furious at Maximo's refusal, ordered his immediate execution. But not just his, but his family's as well, making sure that nothing was left of what had been his life before him. Maximo was taken into custody, but a flame of anger and pain burned inside him. He knew that his time was short, and that, if he did not escape, he would not only die, but would also lose everything he loved. When the time came for his execution, Maximo, with the cunning of a veteran warrior, he managed to free himself from his captors, killing the men who were guarding him. Wounded and exhausted, he began his desperate flight towards Hispania, where his family was waiting, not knowing that danger was quickly approaching. As he ran, his heart racing and blood dripping from his wounds, Maximo knew that he had to reach his home before Commodus's men. But fate, cruel and merciless, was not on his side. He arrived at his farm only to find it in ruins, his home destroyed, and his wife and son dead, crucified and burned by the Roman legions under the orders of Commodus. Maximo fell to his knees, unable to contain the cry of pain that arose from his soul. Everything he had fought to protect, everything he loved, had been taken away in the most brutal way possible. His world, once full of honor and glory, had been reduced to ashes and death. With bloodied hands, Maximo dug the graves of his wife and son, burying them with reverent care, as if in that act he could give them the peace that was denied to them in life. As he placed the last stones on their graves, he felt a part of him die too. He was no longer a general, no longer a man, but a shadow, a specter of what he had been. Destroyed, both physically and emotionally, Maximo fell into unconsciousness, waiting to die alongside his family. But fate, once again, intervened, and he was found by a group of slave traders who captured him, seeing him as a valuable commodity. When Maximo woke up, he was no longer a free man. His captors had sold him to a gladiator merchant named Proximo, who would lead him to a life of fighting in the gladiatorial arenas, far from the glory of Rome, far from justice, but increasingly closer to the revenge that his heart longed for. Chapter 3: Flight and Loss. The crackling of wood in the campfire was the only thing that broke the silence of the night. Maximo lay unconscious, his wounds crudely treated by the slave traders who had found him. However, his mind was not at peace. His dreams were stormy, filled with memories of his home, his wife, and son. Images of his sun-drenched estate in Hispania intermingled with the brutal reality of his mangled bodies. He was a lost soul, trapped in a limbo between life and death, between the desire for revenge and the need to die. When he woke up, he found himself in a wooden carriage, tied hand and foot along with other slaves. His muscles ached, his body was exhausted, but his mind was clearer than ever. The man, who had once been a general of the powerful Roman legions, was now just a shadow of his former self. His captors looked at him curiously, wondering what had led a man with the marks of a soldier to fall so low. The carriage moved slowly through arid and dusty landscapes. As the sun rose in the sky, Maximo realized that he was being carried toward an uncertain destination, far from everything he knew. His spirit, although broken, was not completely destroyed. He knew that, as long as he breathed, he still had a mission: to survive, find a way to avenge his family, and fulfill the promise he had made to Marcus Aurelius. Days later, he arrived at the slave market of Zanzibar, a city in North Africa known for its gladiatorial arenas. Here, human life had a price, and a man's worth was measured by his ability to fight and kill. Maximo was sold to Proximus, a former gladiator who now ran a ludus, a gladiator school. Proximo was a man hardened by years in the arena, and although his days of fighting were over, his cunning and toughness remained intact. "What is your name?" Proximo asked, looking at Maximo with a critical eye. Maximo, still weakened, raised his head and responded in a raspy voice. "My name doesn't matter anymore." Proximo smiled, recognizing the pride and desperation in the man in front of him. In the arena, names don't matter. Only strength, skill, and the will to live matters. If you can fight, you can survive. If you survive, maybe one day you can be free. Proximo was not a cruel man, but he understood well the rules of life as a gladiator. Under his tutelage, Maximo began training, forced to rebuild his strength and abilities. Every day was a fight for survival, and every night, memories of his family haunted him. However, Maximo did not allow himself to succumb to despair. He knew that his only hope for revenge was to survive in the arena, make a name for himself, and eventually, find his way back to Rome. In the Ludus, Maximo found himself surrounded by other men, all of them slaves like him, but with different origins and destinies. Some had been born slaves, others had been captured in war, and some, like Maximo, they had fallen from the heights of power to the depths of servitude. Among them was Juba, a man from Nubia, whose kindness and wisdom stood out in such a brutal place. Juba and Maximo formed a bond of friendship, based on mutual respect and understanding of loss. Juba had lost his family, and he understood the pain that Maximo carried in his heart. "It doesn't matter what they do to us, Maximo," Juba told him one night, while they were looking at the stars. "No one can take away what you carry inside here. Your memories, your love, all of that remains with you. And when the time comes, you will be with them again." Maximo did not respond, but Juba's words resonated in his mind. Although hope seemed distant, he still kept it alive, even if it was in the depths of his being. He knew that he could not afford to die, not until he had fulfilled his mission. The day of his first fight in the arena came quickly. The crowds in Zucabar were small compared to what Maximo knew he would find in Rome, but his shouts were just as ferocious. The gladiators were brought to the center of the arena, surrounded by cages of wild animals and armed with primitive weapons. Proximo had given them one last piece of advice before leaving: win the public, and you will win your freedom. Maximo fought like never before. Every swing of his sword, every movement of his body, was driven by pent-up fury, by the pain of his loss, and by the desire to do justice. The crowd, initially indifferent, soon began to cheer him on. They saw something different in him, a spark of greatness not often found in lesser arenas. After a bloody and fierce battle, Maximo was left standing over the bodies of his enemies. The crowd roared in approval, and Proximo, watching from the shadows, he saw in Maximo the potential to be more than just a gladiator. He knew this man could go far, perhaps even to the Colosseum in Rome. That night, as Maximo cleaned the blood from his body, he thought about his family, his destroyed home, and the promise he had made. Although he was still a long way from Rome, he felt that he had taken the first step on his path to revenge. He knew the road would be long and dangerous, but he was willing to take it to the end. Chapter 4: The Birth of a Gladiator. The sun rose over the sands of Zucabar, casting long shadows on the stone walls that surrounded the ludus of Proximo. For Maximo, the days had begun to blend into a routine of training, fighting and survival. But in the midst of this monotony, something new was being born, a reputation. The men with whom he shared his days respected him, not only for his skill in battle, but for the intensity with which he fought. as if each fight was a matter of life or death, which, in reality, it was. Juba had become his closest companion, offering words of comfort and wisdom. While other gladiators saw the arena as a punishment or a chance to survive, Maximo saw it as a battlefield, one where each victory brought him one step closer to Rome, one step closer to avenging his family. One morning, Proximo gathered them all in the center of the ludus. His gaze was hard, but there was a flash of emotion in his eyes, something unusual for such a weathered man. "Today will be a special day," he said, walking slowly among the men. "Those who survive today will have the opportunity to fight in Rome." In the Colosseum, a murmur of astonishment ran through the gladiators. The Colosseum was the pinnacle of the arenas, a place where the greatest fighters from across the empire fought for glory. For many, it was an impossible dream. For Maximo, it was an opportunity. Proximo continued, his tone now filled with a mixture of warning and motivation. "But make no mistake. Fighting in the Colosseum is not only an honor, it is a challenge that few survive. Rome is not like Zucabar. There, death is a spectacle, and only the strongest and most cunning stay alive. But those who manage to win over the public, those can change their destiny." Maximo listened attentively, his mind already focused on what was to come. He knew that he couldn't afford to fail. Not only was his life at stake, but also the promise of revenge, the promise of justice for his family. The day of the big test came quickly. The gladiators were taken to an arena larger than the one they knew, but small compared to what awaited them in Rome. The fights that day were designed to measure not only skill, but also endurance, strategy, and the ability to work as a team. Maximo was paired with Juba and two other gladiators, men he could trust to hold the line in battle. In front of them, a series of equally trained and desperate opponents. The doors to the arena slammed shut, and the fight began. The first minutes were a chaos of steel and blood. Maximo led his small group with military precision, directing each movement as if he were once again commanding a legion. He used not only his strength, but also his intelligence, making every blow count, every step calculated. As the match continued, he began to notice a change in the crowd. At first, the spectators had been cheering without much enthusiasm, but little by little, their shouts became more fervent. They were responding to the way Maximo fought, to the unwavering determination he displayed. In his mind, he understood Proximo's words. "Win the public, and you will win your freedom." Maximo and his group finally managed to defeat their opponents, and when the last enemy fell, the arena erupted in cheers. They had won, not only the battle, but the public's favor, a crucial step on their path to the Colosseum. Proximo watched from a distance, satisfied. He knew that he had in Maximo a gladiator who could make history, who could turn his ludus into a legend. But he also understood that this man was not like the others. There was something in his eyes, something deeper than the simple desire to survive. Proximo didn't know exactly what he was, but he was determined to take advantage of it. That night, Maximo sat next to Juba, both exhausted but satisfied. The taste of victory was sweet, but Maximo did not allow himself to fully enjoy it. He knew that each victory brought him closer to Rome, but he also reminded him of the mission he must fulfill. Juba watched him silently for a moment before speaking. "Today you were more than a gladiator, Maximo. You were a leader. But I still see the sadness in your eyes. You can't let the pain consume you. The arena is a place for the living, not the dead. Maximo nodded, recognizing the truth in the words of his friend. However, he knew that the pain was a part of him now, a wound that would not heal until he had fulfilled his vengeance. However, he also knew that he was not alone. Juba and other gladiators trusted him, and at that moment he decided that he would not only fight for his family, but also for the men who had become his new family, those who depended on him to survive. With his gaze fixed on the future, Maximo prepared for what was to come. The Colosseum awaited him, and with it, the inevitable encounter with the man who had destroyed his life. He knew the battle would be long, but he also knew that he was a man born to fight. And as long as the fire of vengeance burned in his heart, he would keep going. Maximo's rise as a gladiator is outlined, showing how his leadership and skill. They begin to gain the attention and respect of both their peers and the public. Chapter 5, The Colosseum and the Showdown. Rome. The capital of the empire, a city of power and grandeur, where the streets were paved with history and the buildings resonated with the echoes of past conquests. For many, Rome was the center of the known world, a symbol of civilization and strength. But for Maximo, Rome was now a place of betrayal and pain. As he approached the city, along with the other gladiators selected by Proximo, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He had dreamed of returning, but not under these circumstances. His heart beat with a constant rhythm, driven by the determination to face his destiny. The Colosseum stood imposingly, a marvel of Roman engineering, with its marble and stone structure that seemed to touch the sky. For gladiators, the Colosseum represented both an opportunity and a sentence. It was the place where men became legends, or simply disappeared into oblivion. For Maximo, it was the arena where he would finally come face to face with the man responsible for his misfortune. Commodus. Upon arrival, the gladiators were taken inside the building, an underground labyrinth of dark hallways, cells, and preparation rooms. The roar of the crowd overhead filtered through the stone walls, creating a tense atmosphere. The men knew that every step they took brought them closer to battle, and many silently prayed to their gods for protection and strength. Proximo, who had fought in the Colosseum in his youth. He spoke a few last words to them before leaving them to face his fate. Remember what I have taught you. Here, in Rome, death is a spectacle. Fight well, and you will be remembered. Fail, and you will turn to dust. But those who conquer the public will be able to achieve freedom. Maximo prepared himself in silence, adjusting his armor and mentally reviewing the strategies he had learned throughout his life. He was not afraid of death, the only thing he feared was failing in his mission. His purpose was clear: survive, win, and find a way to get closer to Commodus. When the doors to the arena finally opened, sunlight flooded the dark hallways, momentarily blinding the gladiators. Maximo emerged into the arena, surrounded by a crowd roaring with anticipation. The size of the Colosseum was staggering, with thousands of faces watching, waiting for bloodshed. The first combat of the day was a reenactment of a famous battle in Roman history. And Maximo was assigned to the side of the barbarians, those destined to lose. However, he had no intention of fulfilling that destiny. He organized the other gladiators into a defensive formation, using his military experience to coordinate his movements. When the combat began, the gladiators fought with a ferocity that surprised the crowd. Despite being at a disadvantage, Maximo and his team managed to turn the situation around, defeating their opponents and winning the public's favor. The crowd, initially hostile, began chanting Maximo's name. His leadership and skill in combat were undeniable, and he quickly began to stand out as one of his favorite gladiators. In the stands, Commodus watched the scene with growing interest. He had heard rumors about a gladiator who fought like a general, a man whose combat prowess was surpassed only by his charisma in the arena. When Maximo removed his helmet after the battle, revealing his face to the public, Commodus was paralyzed with surprise. This was no ordinary gladiator, it was Maximo Decimus Meridius, the general whom he had left for dead. Commodus leaned toward his sister, Lucilla, and whispered, "Is it possible? Could it be him?" Lucilla, who had loved Maximo in the past, felt a lump in her throat as she recognized him. She knew what this meeting meant, not only to her, but to the entire empire. Maximo was alive, and his presence in Rome was a direct threat to Commodus' power. After the battle, Maximo was brought before Commodus, who was accompanied by his guard and Lucilla. The air was thick with tension, and every step Maximo took echoed in the silence of the room. When they were finally face to face, Commodus looked at him with a mixture of anger and surprise. The general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who challenges an emperor. Commodus said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. "Who would have thought that he would ever find you here, in this situation?" Maximo looked him straight in the eyes, without a trace of fear in his expression. "My name is Maximo Decimus Meridius, commander of the northern armies, general of the Felix legions. Loyal servant of the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Father of a murdered son, husband of a murdered wife, and I swear that I will take revenge, in this life or the next." Maximo's words fell like a hammer, filled with an intensity that left Commodus breathless. For a moment, the emperor hesitated, aware that the man in front of him was no simple gladiator, but a symbol of everything he had tried to destroy. But Commodus, being a man of power, could not allow that threat to remain. "Then you will die," Commodus replied, trying to maintain his composure. "You will die in the sand, like the others." Maximo did not respond. He knew that Commodus's words were empty, spoken to hide his fear. He knew that as long as he had the public's support, Commodus couldn't just get rid of him. And so, the confrontation between the fallen general and the usurping emperor began to take shape. Not only in the shadows of the palace, but under the relentless light of the Colosseum. That night, Maximo reflected on what had happened. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that each day in the arena brought him closer to his goal. With each victory, he gained more support, not only among the public, but also among the gladiators and, perhaps, even among those who had lost faith in Commodus. The Colosseum, which had once been just a place of death, now it became a battlefield where Maximo could fight for something greater than his own survival. He would fight for justice, for the memory of his family, and for the honor that was taken from him. The battle had begun, and it would not stop until Commodus paid for his crimes. In this, the first confrontation between Maximo and Commodus, where tensions and the fate of Rome begin to rise to the boiling point. Chapter 6, Alliances and Betrayals. The Colosseum had begun to become a stage not only for physical battles, but also for political games. Maximo, with each victory in the arena, established himself not only as an invincible gladiator, but also as a symbol of resistance against the tyranny of Commodus. He knew his time was limited. Commodus would look for an opportunity to get rid of him before he became too powerful. But Maximo had a plan: use his growing popularity to gather allies, both inside and outside the arena. One night, while he was recovering from his battle wounds, Maximo received an unexpected visitor in his underground cell. The door opened slowly, and a hooded figure entered. Maximo, always on guard, immediately stood up, ready to face any threat. But when the figure removed its hood, he was met with a familiar face. Lucilla, Commodus's sister, was standing in front of him. Her expression was serious, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. It had been a long time since they had last seen each other. But the feelings they once shared were still there, latent beneath the surface. "Maximo," she whispered, coming closer, "I came as soon as I knew you were alive. You have no idea what it means to me to see you standing here." Maximo watched her in silence, her mixed feelings. He had loved Lucilla, but now he could only think of the betrayal of her family, of the death that Commodus had brought into his life. "Why are you here, Lucilla?" he asked, his tone cold but controlled. Lucilla lowered her gaze, aware of the distance that had been created between them. "I came because I can't stand what my brother has done. You know I'm not like him. I want to help. I want to see Rome freed from his madness." Maximo looked at her with a mixture of distrust and hope. He knew that Lucilla was a cunning woman, who understood power better than most. If she was willing to help him, she could be the key to overthrowing Commodus. But he also knew that his closeness to Lucilla put him in even greater danger. "If you decide to help me," Maximo finally said, "you do so with full knowledge of what that means. Commodus will not hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in his way, even his own sister." Lucilla nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm willing to take that risk. Rome cannot survive under his rule, and neither can we. But I can't do it alone. I need your strength, your leadership. Together, we could rally those still loyal to Marcus Aurelius. We could overthrow Commodus and restore the Republic." Maximo listened to her, his mind already making plans. He knew that he would have to move carefully, that each step would have to be perfectly calculated. Any mistake could be fatal, not only for him, but for everyone around him. "There are men in the Senate who still remember your father's reign," Maximo said. "If we get his support, we might have a chance. But I need more than words, Lucilla. I need action." Lucilla nodded, her mind already working on how she could move the pieces on the board. "I will speak with Gracchus, a senator who was always loyal to my father. He is a man of principle, and I know that he does not approve of Commodus' reign. If we convince him to join us, others will follow. But you must stay strong, Maximo. I need time." Maximo looked into her eyes, searching for the truth in her words. He knew he was walking a tightrope. But he also knew that this was his best chance to fulfill his mission. "Do what you must, but do it quickly. Time is not on our side." Lucilla nodded and, after a pause, she leaned toward him. "Be careful, Maximo. I can't lose you again." With those words, she withdrew, leaving him alone in the darkness of his cell. Maximo remained silent, reflecting on what had just happened. He knew Lucilla was playing a dangerous game, but he also knew it was a move he had to make. He was confident that she could muster the support necessary to challenge Commodus. But he also knew that each day he passed brought him closer to an inevitable confrontation. The next few days were a mix of arena combat and secret meetings. Lucilla kept her promise and began to build networks of support among the senators who still longed for a Rome free from the yoke of Commodus. Gracchus, the senator with whom Lucilla had spoken, proved to be a valuable ally. Despite his advanced age, he was an influential man, respected for his integrity and principles. With him at his side, Maximo began to see a ray of hope in the midst of the darkness. Meanwhile, in the arena, Maximo continued to fight, each fight a test of his endurance, and each victory brought him closer to his goal. Maximo's popularity among the people of Rome was growing, which worried Commodus. He knew that, although he was the emperor, his power depended largely on the favor of the people. And that favor was beginning to lean towards Maximo. Commodus, increasingly paranoid, began to suspect that something was brewing against him. His spies in the palace informed him of unusual movements among the senators, of clandestine meetings that he could not ignore. Tension in Rome was growing, and Commodus, feeling that his power was threatened, decided to take drastic measures. One night, while Maximo was resting in his cell, he was awakened by the sound of hurried footsteps. The door burst open, and a group of Commodus's guards entered, armed and with grim expressions. "The emperor has ordered your death, Maximo," said the leader of the guards, his voice cold and emotionless. "Your days in the sand are over." Maximo rose slowly, his muscles tense, but his mind remained calm. He had waited for this moment. He knew that Commodus would not stand by while he gained power. But Maximo was not willing to die without a fight. In one swift movement, he disarmed the first guard that approached him, using his newly acquired sword to defend himself. The combat was fierce, but Maximo, with his experience and combat skills, managed to defeat the guards one by one. When the last fell, Maximo knew that his time in Rome was coming to a critical point. Commodus had revealed his hand, and now was the time to act. Wounded but not defeated, Maximo escaped from the ludus, taking refuge in the shadows of the city. He knew that he could not face Commodus alone. He needed to gather his allies and launch a decisive attack before the emperor could consolidate his power. Lucilla and Gracchus joined him in a safe hiding place, their faces reflecting the seriousness of the situation. "Commodus has shown that he is willing to kill you," Lucilla said, her voice trembling with worry. "We must act now, before it is too late." Maximo nodded, aware of the urgency of the situation. "There is no turning back now. Summon all those who are willing to fight. This will be our last chance." With those words, the resistance against Commodus began to take shape. Senators, gladiators, and disaffected citizens joined the cause, forming an alliance determined to restore justice to Rome. Maximo, the general turned gladiator, was preparing to lead his final battle, one that would decide not only his fate, but also the future of the entire empire. Here political intrigues and betrayals begin to surround Maximo as he prepares to confront Commodus. As alliances form and tensions rise, so does the climax with the final fight. Chapter 7, The Last Battle. The night in Rome was filled with palpable tension. The city, which had once been a symbol of power and glory, now seemed to be plunged into impending darkness. In the shadows, far from the curious eyes of the citizens, a group of men and women met secretly, preparing what would be a decisive blow against the tyrant who had seized the throne. Maximo, hidden in a makeshift shelter along with Lucilla, Gracchus, and a small group of loyal senators, reviewed the plan once again. He knew they could not fail. If they did, the consequences would be devastating not only for them, but for all of Rome. His eyes fell on the tired but determined faces of his allies. Aware that each of them was willing to sacrifice his life for the cause. "Commodus's guards will be patrolling the streets," Gracchus said, his voice hoarse with worry. "We'll need a distraction to keep them occupied as we approach the palace." Maximo nodded. They had coordinated with the gladiators and slaves who were willing to fight. Many of them had lost everything because of Commodus, and now they saw in Maximo the last hope for justice. "Our men are already in position," Maximo responded. "When they give the signal, we will begin the attack. We cannot allow ourselves doubts. Commodus must be overthrown this night." Lucilla, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. "There is something I must do before the battle begins," she said, her eyes full of determination. "I must face Commodus, alone. He won't suspect me, and that will give us an advantage." Maximo looked at her, worried. "Lucilla, it's too dangerous. Commodus is desperate, he could hurt you." But Lucilla shook her head. "I'm the only one who can get close enough without arousing suspicion. I will do what is necessary to make sure he is unprotected when you arrive." Maximo knew there was no way to stop her. The determination in his voice was unwavering. With a sigh, he nodded. "Be careful," he told her, his voice low but charged with emotion. "I can't lose you." Lucilla offered him a sad smile before leaving the shelter, disappearing into the darkness of the night. As Lucilla headed towards the palace, Maximo and the others began to move, their hearts pounding as they approached the target. The streets of Rome were silent, broken only by the crunch of footsteps and the murmur of resistance moving in the shadows. Upon reaching the palace gates, Maximo gave the signal. At that moment, an explosion and fire was heard at the other end of the city. The agreed signal for the gladiators and slaves to begin their attack, distracting the imperial guards. Chaos erupted in the streets, as the plan was put into action. Inside the palace, Lucilla walked through the luxuriously decorated hallways, her heart pounding. She knew that she only had one chance to achieve her goal. When she arrived at the throne chamber, she found Commodus sitting alone, his face illuminated by the light of the torches. The emperor was restless, his eyes moving from side to side, reflecting his paranoia. "Sister," Commodus said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "I can't help but feel like something is wrong tonight." "Something in the air." Lucilla, trying to remain calm, approached him. "It's just your imagination, Commodus. The gods have given you this throne, and you will maintain it. But you must trust me." Commodus looked at her, trying to read her intentions, but fatigue and fear clouded him. He nodded, apparently convinced, and let Lucilla come closer. "You know I've always been on your side," Lucilla continued, her voice soft. "But there is something you should know." Before she could continue, a loud knock resounded at the parlor doors, and Lucilla knew that her time was up. Commodus's guards burst into the room, alerted by the chaos unfolding in the city. Maximo and his men had arrived at the palace, eliminating the guards who stood in their way. The general fought with the ferocity of a lion, his mind focused on only one goal: finish off Commodus. Finally, Maximo arrived at the throne chamber, his body covered in sweat and blood, his eyes fixed on the man who had taken everything from him. Commodus, upon seeing him, rose from his throne, fear and anger fighting for control of his face. "Traitor!" cried Commodus, drawing his sword. "Do you think you can take away what's mine?" Maximo didn't say a word, advancing slowly towards him, his sword ready at his disposal. The two men faced each other, their gazes meeting in a duel of wills before their swords crossed in an explosion of sparks. The combat was fierce, both fighting with everything they had. Comfortable, although younger and more agile, he was no match for Maximo's experience and strength. As the fight continued, it became clear that the end was near. With a devastating blow, Maximo disarmed Commodus, causing him to fall to the ground. Comfortable, wounded and defeated, he crawled back, his face distorted with panic. "You can't kill me," he pleaded. "I am the Emperor. I am Rome." Maximo, breathing heavily, looked at the man who had once been his friend, now reduced to a shadow of what he had been. "Rome does not belong to you," Maximo said in a firm voice. "Rome belongs to the people." And with a swift and decisive movement, Maximo plunged his sword into Commodus's chest, ending the tyranny of his reign. Commodus's body fell to the floor, motionless, as silence filled the room. Lucilla, who had witnessed everything, approached Maximo, her eyes filled with tears. "She did it," he whispered. "You freed him." Maximo, exhausted but relieved, dropped his sword. He knew that, although the battle was over, his own journey was coming to an end. Injuries and exhaustion had taken their toll, and his time in this world was fading. Lucilla, realizing the severity of his injuries, held him in her arms, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Maximo, stay with me. Rome needs you." But Maximo, with a weak smile, shook his head. "Rome no longer needs me, Lucilla. You freed her. Now it's your turn to guide her." With those last words, Maximo closed his eyes, feeling the peace he had longed for so long. He knew that he would be reunited with his family in the afterlife, and that his death would not be in vain. Lucilla, sobbing, held him until her breathing stopped. Maximo, the general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, and the gladiator who challenged an emperor. He had finally found the rest of it. On the streets of Rome, news of Commodus's death spread quickly. The people, who had suffered under his yoke, began to celebrate the fall of the tyrant. And as the sun rose over the city, Rome prepared for a new dawn, one guided by justice and hope. Maximo's final sacrifice frees Rome from the tyranny of Commodus. This narrative reaches its conclusion, leaving a legacy of heroism and redemption. I hope you liked the video. Comment and like if so. Subscribe so you encourage me to create more content for you. From time to time, I upload videos of the most varied topics, touching on a little bit of everything. But mainly, I focus on my own work. Scholastar. I give writing advice. Blender classes. I talk about my experiences in electronics and repairing cell phones. I give other tips about daily life. I like the game of Go. It is simple and profound at the same time, like life itself. And I also share my favorite tastes, so sometimes YouTube censors me from time to time. If you support me with a like, a comment or a subscription, you will help me bypass the algorithm's censorship. After all, I upload videos with useful information for everyone, and even more so if they share my same tastes. Greetings to all. Until a next video.